Hello Dark Case family, welcome home. This is Things You May Later Regret Knowing, Volume 7. I know you all really enjoy these videos, well maybe enjoy isn't the right wording, but you know what I mean. I just want to take this opportunity to really thank you all so much for being here. Your support means a huge amount to me, and I'm not just saying that. Being a creator like this can be a weirdly lonely experience, and that gives me a lot of time to think about stuff. And I think we're probably all quite guilty of that. I know from the conversations that we have that a lot of you feel like outcasts, or like you never fully fitted in for whatever reason. And here, I really believe that the Dark Case family provides me and you with somewhere to hang out. It's a nice little safe, warm, but dark place to be. I also have to say a special thank you to the Inner Circle over on Patreon. We're all in a private Discord server, and it's really starting to warm up nicely. We talk about our pets, breakfast cereals, and we share memes, all the good and important things. Basically, what more could you want? So if you want in on that, then you can click the Patreon link down below, and you can join the Inner Circle too. And when you do that, I will send you the invite to the Discord server personally. Today I'm going to share with you 4 very real stories from this weird world that we live in, and chances are you've never heard them ever before. Each one is carefully selected and crafted to give you that weird feeling in your gut, that feeling that we're all chasing, but it seems harder and harder to find. Oh, and there's one thing that I've been wanting to tell you for a while. I am never going to have... Every single day, more than 100,000 flights take place, and obviously most go without a hitch. They take millions of travelers to dream destinations, they reunite families and loved ones, and they let rich people in suits negotiate stuff on foreign soil. From time to time, with millions of flights per year, there are always going to be some cases of civil aviation malfunctions, and occasionally emergency landings have to be made. Perhaps a plane will be diverted, and of course sometimes there are, unfortunately, crashes. But this story is really none of the above. It is genuinely one of the most insane things I have ever come across, and it was frustratingly so avoidable. The details of this case were shrouded in mystery for a while, with the airline, Aeroflot, trying its best to suppress the bizarre circumstances that surrounded this terrible event. But eventually, in this instance, the truth did find the light of day, though no one could truly fathom how these events came to be, nor why they were not prevented by their professionals on board when this happened more than 30 years ago. It would take a revelation from the black box recording to finally reveal what actually took place, how rapidly this all escalated, and how gravely it ended. Aeroflot Flight 593 departed the international airport in Moscow, Russia, with a full set of 63 passengers and 12 flight crew on board. All of them were eager to get to Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong on March the 23rd, 1994. Things were going smoothly as the craft made its way over Siberia, and at 12:30 a.m. it hit the Mongolian border. Captain Andrei Danilov then left the cockpit to take a rest. After all, this was a long flight. This left the rest of the flight to Yaroslav Kundrinsky and First Officer Igor Piskaryov. Another pilot, Vladimir Makarov, was also present that day, but he was not flying. Believing them more than capable, Danilov went to rest as protocol required and allowed. However, the captain's break would lead to some tomfoolery in the one place that should really be taken very seriously. It was only shortly after the captain took leave that the craft vanished from the radars at ground control, and the story of Flight 593 literally spiraled out of control. Two of the passengers on board that day were none other than relief pilot Kudryntski's children. They were his 13-year-old daughter, Yana, and 15-year-old son, Eldar. It's not unusual for children to request to visit the cockpit, especially those that dream of flying, but generally speaking, they're not allowed. However, on this day, the father could not refuse his children. Kudryntski's ego, maybe even the love of his offspring, must have overruled common sense that fateful morning, and he decided to show his kids what went on in the cockpit. Not long after taking off, the father thought it would be an amazing experience for Yana and Eldar if they got to fly the plane themselves. But what professional pilot would allow a child to control an aircraft full of passengers? Obtaining a pilot's license is no easy feat. You need to study hard for years, and it requires countless hours of simulator training before you are even let loose in a real cockpit. The sheer level of responsibility of flying a plane like this means that if you're not qualified, you don't get anywhere near the controls. So of course, the very thought of an untrained child having a go is ludicrous. And indeed, this ridiculous notion raises two major questions. Surely Kudryntski didn't think they were actually capable, and he must have known it probably wasn't a safe idea. The answer is, Kudryntski didn't think they actually could, nor did he think that his kids were actually going to take over the controls. Instead, the plan was to cleverly utilize the autopilot and handheld features to convince his two children that they were truly flying over the Mongolian mountains like real professionals. The idea was pretty harmless and it seemed safe enough. It doesn't appear that it raised any alarm bells with Kudryntski's colleagues. So the father switched the plane to heading select, adjusting the autopilot a little to convince his excited daughter that she was actually piloting. But what began as an innocent idea, and what seemed like fun and games from a cool dad, would rapidly take a dramatic turn. Yana flew without a hitch. It must have been an amazing moment for the 13-year-old, as she sat with her proud father watching closely over her. But this non-regulation fun would be short-lived in the life-changing minutes that followed. And then at 12:51, Eldar took the helm. And at 12:55, just short of half an hour away from their destination, the father would take his eye off the ball, a mistake that would have catastrophic consequences. Shortly after the boy took the pilot's seat, Sister Yana began to ask her father if she could go to the first class area, which led the two of them to have a brief discussion. It was around this time that Eldar, being the older of the two, was probably beginning to guess that he didn't actually have control. However, with his father distracted by his sister's questions, the 15-year-old, who was stronger than his sister, actually managed to force the control column enough to override the autopilot momentarily. The contradiction to the autopilot switched the ailerons into manual mode. The ailerons are some of the flaps on the wings, meaning the boy now actually did have partial control of the aircraft. Unknowingly, this nudged the trajectory, causing the craft to veer. Noticing that he had done something, the boy began asking his father, who was still speaking to Yara at the time, why the plane was turning, which is heard clearly in the black box audio. His question confused everyone in the cockpit. He knew that the plane should not be turning. What followed next took place in just 9 seconds, as the seriousness of the situation escalated unfathomably in front of everyone's eyes. Bewildered by the boy's question, the pilots looked at the dashboard for reassurance, and it was only then that they saw the plane was indeed turning. While they were busy focusing on the data that they were seeing in real time, the plane also started rolling precariously to the right, somehow without anyone noticing. Following Eldar's question and the change in the meter readings, pilot Piskaryov now began to show concern, asking if the route had been lost. To which Marakov replied they were entering a zone. They saw on their display a holding pattern signal which indicated that they were being delayed from their route within a designated airspace. A holding pattern usually only kicks in autopilot when a plane has to wait for landing. For instance, if they arrive at the destination early, or there are other aircraft using the runways, meaning the plane needs to be delayed. The holding pattern will keep the plane flying in a specified zone until they eventually find a safe and suitable landing window. But in this instance, the aircraft was nowhere near its destination, nor was it close to an airport. So to them, the holding pattern made zero sense. It seems that the harsh change in direction seemed to have prompted the holding pattern, which baffled them so much that not one of them had noticed the plane had also just rolled into an almost 45-degree angle. All eyes are on the controls and the unexpected signal. Meanwhile, the plane was heading quickly into danger. The aircraft had also now accelerated wildly as a result of Eldar's manual override, seemingly without warning. The unmistakable effects of 22 pounds of G-force now physically alerted everyone to the change in speed. That was a crucial moment in which they should have taken action, but the inexperienced pilots were unprepared for what would follow, and with fear now overwhelming them, they misunderstood, miscommunicated, and mishandled the unfolding events. Piskaryov can be heard yelling about the speed in the audio capture. He quickly repeats, "Turn to the other side," desperately. The sheer pressure on the pilots prevented them from leaving their seats, and it made any movements to put this right practically impossible. The 15-year-old was also pinned into the chair. Realizing that he is now unable to return to the pilot seat, Kudrinsky first tells Eldar to keep the stick. Somehow, the teenager was stuck in charge of this aircraft. Piskaryov couldn't access the control column as he was seated in the rear of the cockpit. He was also pinned back by the G-force. The only thing that either pilot could do in that insane moment was to yell instructions at poor Eldar and hope that somehow he could follow them. There was just one problem though. Amid the panic that was captured in the harrowing black box recording, each pilot was giving the boy conflicting instructions. Had they been calm and organized, things could have ended very differently. Even without translation, the frantic voices that can be heard in the audio from Flight 593 terrifyingly paint the fear flowing through everyone present. You can hear the urgency in the voices of the pilots, and you can just imagine the panic felt by everyone. And think just how foolish the father must have felt in that moment, and how scared his son and everyone else on board must have been. The panicked Kudrinsky was rendered helpless, and with the situation rapidly worsening, he barked his orders. With instructions unclear and absolutely zero piloting experience, Eldar could do very little to put this right, so the rolling rapidly continued. In no time at all, the plane was flying completely sideways at a 90-degree angle, with its wings completely vertical instead of horizontal. An A310 cannot turn steeply and maintain altitude, so it quickly began to descend, stall, and nosedive. The instruction, the other side, obviously wasn't specific enough advice from Piskaryov. It did nothing to help the severity of the situation. Kudrinsky then joined in, yelling left, to which Piskaryov countered with to the right. This then caused Kudrinsky to question him. The pair have a rushed argument, with Piskaryov asking his colleague whether he can see, and then insisting on right, before advising Eldar to turn left. This bickering takes place in a matter of mere seconds, before the father tells his son to get away from the controls, yelling, "Go to the back, Eldar. You see the danger, don't you?" At this point, it appears the stall took hold. The autopilot disengaged, and the displays failed. The pilots now had no on-screen visuals as the throttle went idle, but later recovered and constructed flight animations depict the plane's uncontrollable trajectory wildly changing and spinning into a nosedive. This must have caused an incredible amount of turbulence, and the onboard passengers and the rest of the crew must have been terrified for their lives. And who knows what was running through the mind of the captain, now unable to get back into the cockpit. Their plans of touching down in Hong Kong hanging in the balance, with their loved ones in their minds and their lives flashing before their eyes. The sudden stalling lowered the nose of the plane, which in turn reduced the G-force. So at that moment, the pilots managed to assume their positions in the seats. It was now that they should have pushed on a control column and taken over, which they likely would have been trained to do. But instead, led by their fear, they kept trying to level out the banking. Amazingly, despite the chaotic motion, the pilots did manage to level things out several times during the madness, all of which can be heard with alerting alarms beeping throughout. Piskaryov demands full power, and Kudrinsky manages to provide it, as the two then discuss what they're seeing on their instruments. What is clear amid the confusion and chaos to the two panicking men is that their speed is now far too high. Throughout these horrifying seconds, Kudrinsky tries reducing power and even cuts it completely, but his actions were not gentle enough. Instead, this caused more turbulence, and it just made it harder to gain any real control over the aircraft. This must have happened more than once because Piskaryov says, "Gently, not again," along with some cursing in Russian. The captured audio dramatically highlights the severity of the events unfolding in the cockpit. To level the banking, the two of them had to work as a team to get just enough power to control it at just the right moments, as they endeavour to level the plane and save the day. But it is no easy task. There are hopeful moments in a few seconds of audio that suggest they do manage to sync up. But it's all to no avail. Kudrinsky can be heard saying, "Get out now, all is normal," suggesting that the situation is resolved. Piskaryov adds, "Pull up gently, gently I say," but the craft was flying too low to recover. At 12:58, 7 minutes after Kudrinsky broke regulations and gave control of the plane to his children, the Aeroflot Flight 539 plummeted 9,000 meters at 160 miles per hour, and it crashed into a remote mountain hillside. Nobody on the plane survived. 75 souls lost on impact, and all on the back of a foolish decision, followed by an overwhelming situation that no one stepped up to fix. Sadly, those terrifying final 7 minutes could all have been prevented if someone had simply let go of the control column after the initial spin, but fear simply took over. Potholing, which is also sometimes called caving or spelunking, is the exploration of natural underground caves, tunnels and passageways. These subterranean mazes take thousands or even millions of years to form, and sometimes they are just a few inches high, barely big enough to even consider fitting through for most people. The risk of claustrophobia is high, even if it's not something that normally affects you. But it isn't just your mind that can get out of control. It also has the potential to be extremely dangerous. Things like cave-ins, collapses, getting lost or rising water can, and do, happen. In June 1967, the Yorkshire Dales experienced an extended period of dry weather, something that didn't go unnoticed by some avid potholers. This created ideal conditions for seasoned cavers with minimal risk of any flooding. So on Saturday, June 24th, under clear summer skies, a skilled team of 10 entered Mossdale Caverns on Coniston Moor, 4 miles north of Grassington. Mossdale was and still is famous for its extreme difficulty, and it still remains one of Britain's most treacherous cave systems. Quite crazily, its deepest reaches have been seen by fewer people than those that have set foot on the moon. The excited conglomerate were led by veteran caver Dave Adamson, and it included members from both the Happy Wanderers and the Bradford Pothole Club. Perched high on the remote slopes of Coniston Moor, Mossdale Scar is a fragile limestone cliff. So no matter the weather, the landscape always holds a bleakness, a feeling of foreboding that only nature truly knows how to deliver. A rushing stream known as Mossdale Beck cascades down the hillside before vanishing abruptly into the depths of the cavern below. Mossdale Caverns are a rare geological anomaly, and it's not really just a singular underground space. Instead, it's two caves in the same system. Accessed through a narrow fissure, it's a labyrinth of tight, winding tunnels, and they stretch for nearly 7 miles underground. Some of the passageways are just big enough for you to fit your head through, and then pull your body behind you. Regarding the stream, Mossdale Beck, it does actually enter the cave, but it vanishes near the entrance. It seeps into the rock, only to resurface 5 miles away and 900 feet lower down at a place called Black Keld near the River Wharfe an astonishing 18 days later. The journey that water takes is not something I really want to consider, but it must be a very cold, dark and treacherous one. So, the scene is set, and on the rugged terrain of Coniston Moor, the team of 10 made their way into the tight confines of Mossdale Caverns, and opting for a brief exploration of only a few hours, 4 members of the Happy Wanderers safely emerged back to the surface. The remaining 6, however, pressed further into the winding, constricted tunnels. They wanted to see just how far they could push themselves. By 5 p.m, the 4 cavers who had exited early had emerged into the open air, and it was then that a light drizzly rain had begun to fall. 3 of the cavers then departed for nearby village Ingleton, whilst Morag Forbes, engaged to leader Dave Adamson at the time, sought shelter in a nearby barn. As the rain intensified into a downpour, Morag returned to check the cave entrance. Over an inch of rain had already fallen in just 3 hours. It was now pooling on the ground. The normally babbling stream, Mossdale Beck, swelled rapidly, and it was now transforming into a violent surge. Unaware of the storm, the 6 remaining cavers were deep underground, and now the rising floodwaters surged into the cavern. It swallowed the entrance and filled the tunnels with terrifying speed. Things had gone very wrong, very fast. By 9 p.m, the cave entrance had vanished beneath a churning lake of dark water. Remember, this was the 1960s, so calling for help was not as easy as it is now. With no other way to raise the alarm on location, Morag sprinted through the storm for 2 miles before reaching Yarnberry Farm, where owner Mr. Riley was willing to help. He phoned the police, and now finally at 11:10 p.m, the rescue operation was underway. The Upper Wharfedale Fell rescue team arrived on the scene. This group did have experience in cave rescues, but Mossdale Caverns presented an entirely different challenge. Classified as super severe and lacking a detailed map or rescue plan, it was an overwhelming task for their limited resources. Leaders Len Huff and Des Birch quickly recognized the need for reinforcements, and so they contacted larger cave rescue organizations. Within minutes, telephones rang in cavers' pubs across the Dales. Unaware of the unfolding crisis, 2 of the cavers who had exited earlier were now at Martin Arms pub near Ingleton when the call came through. Still exhausted and still not dry from their earlier expedition, they rushed back towards the flooded cave entrance. Meanwhile, cavers from Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cheshire and Derbyshire all braved the torrential rain, racing to Coniston Moor to assist in the rescue. When the rescue teams reached the entrance to Mossdale Caverns, they were met with a frankly nightmarish sight. The cave had vanished beneath a vast swirling lake, completely submerged. A sense of helplessness settled over the rescuers. What could even be done in such relentless rain amid treacherous, mud-choked terrain? The situation was dire, seemingly without a solution. Then, through the darkness and pounding storm, the distant rumble of engines grew louder. A convoy of fire trucks, mechanical diggers, and tractors emerged out of the dark, carefully working their way over the moor, up to the cave. As the first light of dawn broke over Coniston Moor on Sunday, July the 25th, 1967, the landscape resembled that of a war zone. By this time, hundreds of volunteers had turned up to help. They were digging a massive diversion trench. It was 6 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and stretched nearly 100 meters. Many people there used only their bare hands to move the earth, and at the same time, teams scrambled to construct a makeshift dam, a structure which stood 10 feet high, 15 feet thick, and 70 yards long. They used whatever materials they could find, and despite later reinforcement with 10,000 sandbags, the structure remained fragile. It shifted ominously under the immense pressure that it held back. Yet, to those who had fought to build it in just a matter of hours, it felt like a miracle. But the question was, would any of this actually work? Jim Eyre, 41, one of the biggest names in the UK caving scene, was ready and willing to put his life on the line to help those still stuck below ground. Just 1 week before this disaster, Dave Adamson had invited him to join the expedition, but it was an offer that he declined. Perhaps in some way he knew how badly things could go here. Despite his fearless reputation, Mossdale Caverns had always unsettled Jim. But now, standing at the entrance, staring into the flooded abyss, Jim couldn't help but worry, not just for those trapped inside, but for the inexperienced rescuers around him, some barely able to fully grasp the dangers of what they all faced here. To those deep into the world of potholing though, there was a common phrase about this location: Mossdale mania, Russian roulette with nature. And now, against his better judgment, Jim would be leading a team straight into the dark, flooded mouth of hell. Outside the cave, the makeshift dam remained under constant threat from the relentless power of nature. The water was unrelenting. Teams of cavers and volunteers worked tirelessly in shifts, reinforcing it as best as they could. Others rested in short bursts in tents set up on the moor. By late Sunday morning, after hours of grueling effort, and with the aid of 19 water pumps from surrounding fire brigades, the water level finally showed signs of receding. But that meant that now it was time. Jim Eyre and his team were now going to head into the submerged cavern. Even though everyone was exhausted, they were still willing to risk it all. 4 members of the Happy Wanderers, one of the groups that were inside the cave, had all decided to go with Jim on his mission. Emotions were running high. The missing people were their friends, and Jim Cunningham, John Shepherd, John Rushton, and Frank Barnes were lucky to not be down there with them. Now inside the cavern, the team attempted to set up a telephone line, unspooling a long cable into the darkness. The task proved nearly impossible. Floating debris, churning floodwaters, and the suffocating blackness made every movement a struggle. Crawling carefully, their nerves on edge, the rescuers reached a chamber known as the Rough Chamber, a small open space where they could finally stand. But beyond it, the path to the marathon, one of the most feared sections of Mossdale Caverns, was now blocked by a grim and menacing sight. Low, flooded tunnels filled with eerie sounds and unsettling vibrations as air pockets surged through the confined passages. The hours spent inside Rough Chamber were filled with unease. Jim Eyre, despite being twice the age of most of the rescue team, tried to keep their spirits up with his characteristic dry humour. He joked that at any moment now, they'd be hearing their trapped friends calling out from the darkness. And the men did think they heard something. Perhaps, though, it was the cavern's eerie silence merely playing cruel tricks on their minds. In their exhaustion and anxiety, some swore they heard distant voices or the faint splash of water, or maybe their frayed nerves were just betraying them. While the dam outside remained unstable, it thankfully continued to hold. That hurriedly constructed barrier was the only thing preventing the brave rescuers from being swallowed by floodwaters. That thought alone fills me with a sense of dread. As the water inside the cavern slowly receded, the team was joined by Tony Waltham. He was a London-based member of the Happy Wanderers who had raced to Mossdale to assist in any way he could. Now it was his turn to lead the team beyond Rough Chamber and off into the depths of what had become known as Far Marathon. It was now that Waltham learned a heart-stopping fact. No one had ever successfully reached the far end of that passageway before. This was truly uncharted territory. With grim determination, Tony Waltham crawled into the abyss, leading the desperate search for his missing friends. He feared the worst, but clung to hope. Yet it wouldn't be long before his silent fears became a devastating reality. Far Marathon, the long claustrophobic tunnel, felt eerily dry, though water still dripped from its low ceilings. A heavy silence engulfed the man. The previously crushing sound of the running water had now vanished, and thankfully this means that somehow the dam outside was still holding strong. But for the rescue team, the most harrowing challenges still lay ahead. A 900-foot crawl through the passage, a task so grueling it could take up to 5 hours. In places, the tunnel was barely 10 inches high and only 2 feet wide. This would leave no room for survivors to escape in the opposite direction, and the absolute darkness only heightened the sense of dread. Tony Waltham was the first to make a tragic discovery. Devastatingly, 2 bodies lay motionless, and to make the situation even worse, they were blocking the cramped passageway ahead. With no way around them, a decision was made on the spot. The team would have to crawl over them to continue their search. It's hard to fathom being in such close quarters with people that were your friends, not to mention the hopelessness that must have washed over the rescue mission. And things continued to get worse for the team. Just a few yards beyond, Waltham found 3 more explorers, so that was 5 of the missing men accounted for. But the 6th was somewhere else, and there was a chance that they were still somehow alive. The weight of the moment was crushing. Some of the rescuers openly wept, while others were overcome with nausea. Jim Eyre called out to Waltham to try and gain an understanding of the situation. His response was stark and final. "Go back, Jim. They're dead." With no hope of a rescue taking place, Jim Eyre contacted the surface team via the emergency phone line they installed earlier. The response was immediate and urgent. "Get everyone out, now." Outside, the unstable dam was beginning to crumble under the immense force of the water. Twice it collapsed completely, sending freezing torrents surging back towards the cavern. In a desperate bid to hold back the flood, cavers linked arms in the raging stream, forming human barriers throughout the night, a last frantic attempt to protect the entrance. So now 5 bodies had been found, but John Ogden was still missing. Unlike the others though, he was truly an expert cave diver. Could he have survived? Was he simply unconscious somewhere? Maybe he was trapped where no human had ever been before. The rescue team emerged from the mouth of the cave. They were shaken, upset, but otherwise unharmed. However, with the influx of water, they had been forced to leave behind the bodies of their fallen comrades, and they also refused to abandon the search for John Ogden. Meanwhile, the dam was being repaired and could once again hold back the flowing river. With time running out, they turned to Bob Leakey. He was the legendary caver who had first discovered Mossdale Caverns 26 years earlier. Now 53, Leakey had mapped out much of the cave system in the past, and he believed he knew a possible refuge where John Ogden may have survived. If he was still okay, he would be there. And with Bob Leakey willing to put his knowledge to the test, he would now lead the next search team deeper into the caverns, pressing further beyond where the 5 bodies had been found. But fate was against them. The dam was failing once again, and with more rain pouring down, Bob Leakey was forced to retreat. In fact, Bob would never enter another cave. For him, this was enough. Despite the worsening conditions, new teams entered the caverns on Monday night and into Tuesday morning. They were determined to find John. By this stage, Mossdale had become global news. The site was crowded, not just with rescuers, but also with morbid sightseers and TV news crews who had descended onto Coniston Moor. Few now still believed that John Ogden would still be alive, but his friend Brian Boardman, a veteran rescue leader, refused to give up. At 10 p.m. on Tuesday, June the 27th, Boardman led one last desperate search, hoping, against all odds, that John had found an air pocket and was simply waiting it out somewhere deep inside the flooded labyrinth. The team pushed beyond the 5 bodies, searching in every possible crevice of the tunnel. Then they found a gold ring, a chilling clue. Moments later, they spotted a single boot wedged in a narrow fissure. The boot belonged to John Ogden. Somehow he had managed to squeeze into an impossibly tight gap, and perhaps he left behind the ring and boot as a final message to those he knew that would come looking. After an agonizing 5-hour crawl back to the surface, Boardman's team emerged onto the bleak, rain-soaked moor. Waiting anxiously there was John Ogden's father, but as the searchers climbed out of the cave, their haunted expressions told him everything he needed to know. The battle was over. John was gone. He had clearly fought until the end, but his body was never found. Soon, 2 doctors, both experienced in the grim realities of caving tragedies, signed official declarations stating that John Ogden's body had been swept away, and he now must lay in an unreachable part of the caverns, a place from which he could never be recovered. With the rain still falling and the temporary dam now dangerously unstable, retrieving the 5 bodies was deemed impossible. Coroner Stephen Brown consulted with the families, rescue leaders, and the police before making a heartbreaking decision. A special Home Office exemption was granted, allowing an inquest to be held without the bodies. This was an exceedingly rare ruling. Ultimately, the coroner ordered Mossdale Caverns to be permanently sealed with concrete, leaving the caves to serve as a grave for the 6 lost men. For those involved, it was an agonizing outcome. No matter the cost, cavers had always retrieved their fallen friends. Furthermore, blocking a cave, especially one still unexplored, was seen as pretty much unthinkable. Some did try to protest, but it was in vain. After 4 grueling days of searching, the 300 rescuers departed, exhausted, leaving behind those 6 souls, buried forever beneath Coniston Moor. At the inquest, Coroner Stephen Brown acknowledged the bravery of those involved. He said, "There is great admiration for the courage and endurance of those who undertook this activity, but maybe courage and endurance in some cases exceed discretion." The official rescue report offered a somber tribute. Never has so much been done by so many people for such a small reward. Soon after, the concrete was indeed poured into the cavern's entrance. It was now sealed permanently. 2 weeks later, on Friday, July the 7th, 1967, hundreds of mourners gathered at St Mary's Church in Coniston for a memorial service. With the small church packed beyond capacity, a makeshift PA system broadcasted the service outside, meaning that all mourners could be a part of this sad day. Though Mossdale Caverns has faded from public memory, it was never forgotten among cavers. The tragedy became known as Caving's Battle of the Somme, as well as the Underground Everest. The caving community still lends a lot of weight to anyone that can say, "I was at Mossdale." Morag Forbes, who was just 6 weeks away from marrying Dave Adamson, one of the 6 lost men, was left stuck in grief, no doubt questioning if she ran fast enough for help on that night. Every year on the anniversary, as long as they were able, Many of the cavers and rescuers made the journey to the caverns, all to pay tribute to those they lost in the caves. Despite the cave entrance being sealed in 1967 by order of the coroner, in February 1971, a group of friends and family decided to enter the caves through a different passage. After confirming that neither the Home Office, local police, nor farmers had jurisdiction over the common land, the group ventured into Mossdale once more. They, quite amazingly, carefully retrieved the remains of their friends, and they then relocated them to a higher level cave known as Mud Caverns. The chamber was later renamed to the Sanctuary in their honour, and the families were informed of the final resting place of their loved ones. The ghost of Mossdale would live on, and it would continue to haunt those involved in the tragedy. Mark Jackson was one of the NBA's most respected point guards. He was a skilled passer and was seen as a court leader. He played for the New York Knicks in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and there he helped to shape one of the league's toughest teams. And like most players of his time, Jackson had his share of trading cards, collectible snapshots of his career, captured in that weirdly addictive format. One of them, the 1990 NBA Hoops card, seemed like just another piece of sports memorabilia, nothing special. And for nearly 3 decades, that's all it was, a standard, low-value trading card featuring an athlete in his prime, dribbling the ball down the court at Madison Square Garden. But in 2018, a basketball card collector noticed something strange. The focus of the card was still obviously Jackson, but in the background, 2 young men sat courtside watching the game. They looked casual, relaxed, enjoying the moment, blending into the energy of the stadium like any other fans. And for years, no one had given them a second thought, until someone recognized them. They were sitting just feet away from the action, smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. A seemingly innocent piece of sports history had unknowingly captured a dark tale. For nearly 3 decades, the 1990 NBA Hoops Mark Jackson card sat in collections just gathering dust. It wasn't rare, and it certainly wasn't valuable. It was just another mass-produced sports card from an era when basketball memorabilia was really flooding the market. Then, in 2018, a card collector studying old trading cards noticed something unsettling. It was those 2 young men enjoying the game. The collector then got a strange feeling. Something about the image seemed oddly familiar. It fired off neurons in his brain, and he started to make an eerie connection. One of the men was wearing a sweater, the other was in a suit jacket. They were both watching a game and clearly having fun. Now they were in front row seats, so they must have been someone. Maybe celebrities from a long-forgotten sitcom, or maybe a Disney show. At first glance at least, they did just look like another pair of high-rolling Knicks fans, enjoying a prime courtside experience. But then came the moment of realization. The 2 men were Lyle and Eric Menendez. By the time this game took place, both of their parents had sadly had their time on this earth cut short at someone else's hands. It happened whilst they were living in their Beverly Hills mansion. Obviously, a Beverly Hills mansion means that the parents had money, insurances, and all of that was passed down to Lyle and Eric. But of course, they had just suffered an immense loss, so why would they not try and enjoy their lives? It wasn't just the courtside Knicks seats that they splashed out on though. They also bought flashy cars, watches that cost more than my house, and lavish vacations to get out there and really experience life. After all, they knew from their parents, all of this could be ended at any moment, and you can't take your fortune with you. The photo on the card was likely taken between August 1989 and March 1990. This was after their parents' demise, but before the 2 brothers would see their new lifestyle crashing down around them. A seemingly ordinary sports collectible had unknowingly become a piece of true crime history, a snapshot of real monsters hiding in plain sight. You see, the Menendez brothers weren't just privileged kids enjoying a night at a Knicks game. In fact, they were hiding a secret so dark that for people like you and I, it is truly unimaginable. It was a quiet summer night in Beverly Hills, August the 20th, 1989. Inside their $1 million mansion, Father Jose and Mother Kitty Menendez were just settling in for the evening. Jose, a powerful Hollywood executive, was watching TV in the den, eating a bowl of strawberries. Kitty, his wife of over 20 years, was just relaxing nearby. And then, the first thunderous crack rang out. A deafening blast, sudden and unexpected, shattered the silence. Jose was hit. He barely had time to react before another blast hit him, and then another. The force from the pump action had hit him hard, leaving him slumped over, red pooling around him. Kitty was horrified and she tried to run. However, she was too slow. The intruders turned on her next, firing as she scrambled to escape. However, she slipped, collapsing onto the floor. She was harmed, but still alive. The house, once a picture of wealth and success, now echoed with this mother's desperate, ragged breaths. But the assailants weren't done yet. Kitty struggled to lift herself, to crawl away. But they reloaded. They stood over her, and then 1, 2, 3 more deafening blasts. These would leave her unrecognizable. Face, chest, arms, all essentially gone. And just like that, the Beverly Hills mansion, once a home filled with luxury and comfort, had now become a crime scene straight out of a horror movie. The cold-blooded assailants vanished into the night, leaving nothing but carnage and a flickering television screen. Not long after, a frantic 911 call came in. A young man's voice, terrified, hysterical. "Somebody killed my parents."
Beverly Hills emergency.
Yes, police.
What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Someone killed my parents.
Pardon me?
Someone killed my parents.
What? Who? Are they still there?
Yes.
The people...
No.
Were they shot?
Hey, man, too.
Were they shot?
Yes.
They were shot?
Yes.
Oh.
Hello, this is police department.
Yes.
Okay, I want you to come outside. Okay, just come out the front door and
I'm gonna get my brother.
The police arrived quickly to find a scene that would haunt them forever. Jose's body lay motionless. It was obvious what had happened to his head. Kitty was sprawled on the floor. She too bore obvious signs of the blasts. The house was sprayed in red, with shell casings scattered like breadcrumbs, leading to the truth. The young men who had called 911, 2 brothers, both in their early 20s, were found outside, shaking, inconsolable. They were, of course, Lyle and Eric Menendez. They told police they had been out for the night, gone to the movies. They had then returned home to find their parents like this. The officers, seeing their grief, seeing the sobbing and the horror on their faces, just believed them. For months, the case remained a mystery, a double murder in one of America's wealthiest neighborhoods. And embarrassingly for authorities, there were no real clear suspects. People whispered about a mafia hit, a revenge attack, or maybe some Hollywood scandal gone wrong. And meanwhile, Lyle and Eric had buried their parents, received their inheritance, and tried to move on. They bought luxury watches, expensive vacations, sports cars, even those courtside Knicks tickets. And for a while, things really seemed to just level out for them. Until, that is, police started looking a little closer. Until the cracks in their stories started to show. And until, months later, the truth came out. Lyle and Eric Menendez weren't just grieving sons. For months after the murders, the brothers tried to live on as if nothing had happened. In fact, they lived better than ever. They moved into luxury apartments. Their entire lives leveled up overnight. Eric even hired a personal tennis coach in Israel, while Lyle invested in a new restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey. But beneath the surface, their world was falling apart. Authorities had no immediate suspects. At first, they believed the murders were linked to a professional hit. This was given the extreme nature of the state that Jose and Kitty were found in. But then the investigation turned towards the brothers, when their lavish spending spree couldn't be ignored any longer. But it seems that no amount of money could outweigh their guilt. The final blow came when Eric broke down in a therapy session, confessing everything to his psychologist. Once arrested in March 1990, the brothers became one of the most infamous cases of the decade. Their trials were sensational, broadcast across the country. They continued to claim that they were acting in self-defense, that they had suffered years of emotional maltreatment and violations from their father, and the public was divided. Some did see them as cold-blooded, while others believed they were victims for their entire lives. But while the courtroom was filled with arguments and testimonies, something had already captured a quiet and irrefutable piece of evidence from the time that they should have been grieving. The 1990 NBA Hoops trading card, printed and distributed before their arrest, had unknowingly immortalized them in time. Now we see two killers sitting courtside, enjoying their last moments as rich, free men. At the time, no one thought twice about the fans in the background. But looking back, it was a snapshot of deception. Two monsters blending in with the crowd, pretending to be normal. The trial became one of the biggest of the 1990s, drawing comparisons to the O.J. Simpson case in terms of media attention. It was heavily televised, turning the brothers into household names. And whilst they did claim self-defense, the prosecution, however, painted them as calculating killers, claiming they did this to their parents for financial gain only. Things didn't go in the brothers' favour. Lyle and Eric were convicted of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. They were later sent to separate prisons, but were reunited in 2018. The realisation about the trading card spread quickly, and almost overnight, a worthless sports card became infamous and valuable. Collectors were divided. Some found it morbidly fascinating, a bizarre intersection of sports and true crime history. Others felt unsettled, realizing they had unknowingly owned this dark souvenir of a terrible crime. And of course, as interest in the card grew, so did its value. Copies that were once worth pennies started selling for hundreds of dollars, simply because of this eerie connection. And then things got even stranger. Some collectors sent the card to Lyle and Eric Menendez in prison, asking them to autograph it, and for some reason, they did. This blurred the line between memorabilia and pure bad taste. And it also raised a bigger question. Where do we draw the line between historical curiosity and glorifying people like them? To this day, the brothers maintain that their actions were out of fear and not greed. Despite multiple appeals, though, their convictions have never been overturned. Rather than fortune, they only found infamy. Rita Wolfensohn had always been a private woman. For years, she lived alone in her Brooklyn home, tucked away in a neighborhood where people kept themselves to themselves. She wasn't the type to make small talk with neighbors, and she never seemed to have visitors. Those who knew her understood one thing. Rita just didn't want to be bothered. But time had not been kind to the woman. She was now in advancing years. She was blind, and she was living in a house that was starting to fall into disrepair. Piles of newspaper, rotting food, and forgotten objects from decades past filled the space, burying the home in layers of dust and decay. Have no doubt, Rita was a hoarder. Her family rarely checked in, assuming she preferred her solitude. However, Rita's health had in fact failed her to the point that she was rushed to hospital, and it was now that, after years of silence, a relative was forced to visit Rita's home to pick up clothing and supplies. The relative was Josette Buckman, Rita's sister-in-law. She did expect to find clutter and neglect. She knew the house would be messy, that Rita might need help getting it back in order, but she had no idea what was waiting for her inside. Rita's life hadn't always been this way. Years ago, she had been a wife and mother, raising her two sons in the same Brooklyn home that now crumbled around her. But time and tragedy had stripped her world down to pretty much nothing. Her husband Jesse passed away in 1987, and in the following years her eyesight deteriorated. This left her trapped inside a space she could no longer properly care for. The house, once a home, slowly became a prison of hoarding and decay. Unopened boxes, untouched for decades, collected dust in forgotten spaces, and the air was thick with the stale scent of neglect. Rita had 2 sons, Michael and Louis, but she never spoke about them anymore. Louis had moved out some 20 years ago, the family believing he had just abandoned his mother, perhaps just wanting to get out of the family home. There were no phone calls, no visits, no apparent care. And then Michael sadly passed in 2003. If anyone asked Rita about her family now, the conversation would be shut down. People assumed she wanted to be alone. But something about the way she avoided the past felt off to some. When sister-in-law Josette finally stepped inside, the smell hit her first. It was a mix of rotting food, damp fabric, and dust thick enough to choke the air. In a way, the house was exactly what she expected, but somehow it was worse. Trash covered the floors. It made it impossible to walk without stepping on something brittle, something forgotten. Old furniture was swallowed up by debris, magazines, and general trash. The walls, once painted in warm colours, were now stained with time, faded under years of grime. The deeper she walked into the house, the stronger the feeling of unease grew. It was as if the home was stuck in time, frozen in a state of abandonment, apart from the fact that Rita had lived there all along. Some rooms were so filled with junk they were completely inaccessible, sealed off by their own contents. But one door stood slightly ajar. Unlike the rest of the house, the space beyond that door seemed untouched. There was no clutter, no garbage spilling out onto the floor. There was just darkness, as if the room had been waiting to have light shed on it once again. Something about it felt wrong, something that the sister-in-law couldn't name. With slow, hesitant steps, Josette reached out and pushed the door open, and that's when she saw it. At first, it didn't make sense. The room was just entirely different to the rest of the house. There was no newspapers, no trash, no discarded items covering the floor. Instead, everything was still untouched, preserved in a way that felt unnatural. The bed was neatly made, the sheets undisturbed. A dresser stood against the wall, and it was covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like it hadn't been touched in 2 decades. Then Josette's eyes adjusted to the dim light. There was something on the bed. At first, she thought it was a pile of discarded clothing, dark, crumpled fabric lying across a mattress, but something about the shape was wrong. This wasn't just fabric. It wasn't clutter. It was a body. A human skeleton, fully intact, dressed in jeans and socks, resting silently as if it had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. The shock hit all at once. Someone's time on this earth had ended in this very room. Panic surged through Josette as she stumbled back, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just seen. How long had this body been here? Who was it? Why hadn't anyone noticed? And what dark secret did Rita hold? Josette obviously called the police immediately, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what she had found. Officers quickly arrived, pushing their way through mounds of rubbish until they reached the untouched bedroom. The moment they stepped inside, the horror of the situation sank in. The skeleton was completely intact. It was lying in a position that suggested no signs of struggle, no attempt to fight. It was as if the person had simply laid down and never gotten back up. The forensics team carefully examined the remains, searching for any clues to explain what had happened and who this was. Meanwhile, Rita lay in the hospital, seemingly unaware of the chaos unfolding in her home. When officers approached her, they braced for her reaction. Surely she would be shocked, horrified that a body had been found inside her house. But when they asked if she knew anything about it, her answer was something they never expected. "Oh, I thought he moved out." The room was silent. because that's when investigators realized the horrifying truth. The body in the bedroom, in fact, belonged to Louis Wolfensohn, Rita's own son. For over 20 years, his remains had been in the house, slowly decaying while life continued around him. No one had reported him missing. No one had come looking for him. He had simply vanished, and somehow his own mother had never realized he was still there all along. She had never been abandoned after all. Investigators pieced together what little information they could. There were no signs of foul play, no forced entry, no struggle. Louis had likely passed in that room, unnoticed and undisturbed. The most horrifying part, Rita had lived in that same house all those years, walking past his door, never questioning where he had gone, and obviously unable to see him just lying there. The hoard must have covered the obvious smells that would have come from the room, the only viable explanation. Police determined that indeed Rita had no idea he was there. The skeleton wasn't hidden. It had not been covered or buried. It had simply been left behind, waiting to be found. All this time, Rita believed she had been abandoned. But the truth was, in a way, she had never been alone at all. The most likely explanation was that he simply succumbed to natural causes, perhaps some kind of medical emergency, all alone in his room, while his mother lived on just feet away. But why had no one reported him missing? Rita's hoard created a house of isolation. No one visited. People stopped checking in. She lost her husband and both sons. Her family unit dissolved in an instant, and Rita, without the gift of sight, was none the wiser. If no one had ever visited, if no one had ever checked, his body could have remained in that bed forever, perhaps not being found until Rita herself suffered a similar fate. Eventually, the house was cleared out. Louis' remains were laid to rest, and the story faded from the headlines. Rita moved out of the house, and hopefully now she's less alone. Just as I was wrapping up the video, I made an unfortunate discovery. Rita in fact passed away on February the 27th, 2024. What you're seeing on screen right now is a still image from her funeral service. She was laid to rest on March the 3rd, 2024 at Fairchild Funeral Chapel on Northern Boulevard, New York, United States. Seen speaking here is her brother, and it's actually worth watching the service so you get a much better feel for who Rita was.